March 17, 1944, somewhere in the South China Sea. Commander Willard Lafon pressed his eye against the periscope aboard USS Russia, watching a convoy that would change the mathematics of war. 16 cargo ships, shepherded by destroyers and escorts, steaming northwest toward Japan. These vessels carried the oil, rubber, steel, and rice that kept the Japanese Empire breathing. What the convoy commanders did not know, what Japanese naval intelligence had failed to understand despite 3 years of mounting evidence, was that American submarines had evolved into something their doctrine could not counter. The boats were everywhere. The torpedoes finally worked, and the hunters beneath the waves had developed an appetite for destruction that would strangle an empire ship by ship. The story of the Gato-Class submarine is not just about 77 steel vessels built between 1941 and 1944. It is the story of how American industrial power, combined with aggressive tactics and reliable weapons, created a campaign of commerce destruction so devastating that it literally starved Japan into submission. By the time the war ended, American submarines had sunk over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, destroyed more than 1,300 vessels, and killed tens of thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers at sea. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Gato-Class submarines formed the backbone of this campaign, accounting for more enemy tonnage destroyed than any submarine class in history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For Japanese merchant mariners serving in 1944, boarding a transport ship had become a death sentence. They sailed into waters, patrolled by invisible predators that attacked without warning and vanished before escorts could respond. The Japanese called them the Silent Death. American submariners called them Gatos. The genesis of the Gato-Class began not in war, but in the peacetime naval theories of the 1920s and 30s. American submarine doctrine was built around the ideas of Alfred Thayer Mahan, the naval strategist whose concepts dominated American military thinking. Mahan envisioned submarines as fleet scouts that would sortie ahead of the main battle line, identify enemy forces, and whittle down the opposing fleet before a climactic surface engagement decided the war. To accomplish this mission, submarines needed long range to operate far from bases, high surface speed to keep pace with battleship formations, and heavy armament to engage enemy warships. The problem was that achieving all three requirements simultaneously pushed the limits of 1930s technology. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, American submarine designers experimented with various configurations. The S-class boats of the early 20s were too small and short-ranged. The massive V-boats of the late 20s proved unwieldy and expensive. The Porpoise and Salmon classes of the mid-30s came closer to the ideal, but still suffered from limited range and mechanical problems. By 1940, designers at the Bureau of Ships had refined their approach. The Tambor and Gar classes, commissioned between 1940 and 1941, established the basic template. These submarines displaced approximately 1,500 tons, measured over 300 feet in length, and could cruise 11,000 nautical miles without refueling. Their diesel-electric propulsion provided 21 knots on the surface and 8 knots submerged. They carried 24 torpedoes loaded into 10 tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft. The Gato-Class, authorized in the fiscal year 1941 appropriation, improved on this design in subtle but important ways. The diving depth increased from 250 feet to 300 feet, providing a crucial margin of safety when Japanese destroyers dropped depth charges. A watertight bulkhead divided the engine room into 2 compartments, improving survivability if one section flooded. Stronger hull construction using high-tensile steel allowed the boats to withstand greater pressure at depth. These modifications seem minor, but they made the difference between life and death when depth charges detonated overhead. Construction began before the war started. USS Drum, the first Gato laid down, had her keel placed at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard on September 11, 1940. She was commissioned on November 1, 1941, making her the only Gato-class submarine in service when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor 5 weeks later. USS Gato herself, the name ship of the class, was laid down on October 5, 1940, by Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut. She was commissioned on December 31, 1941, 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor transformed the Pacific into a war zone. The attack on Pearl Harbor destroyed the American battle line and with it the entire concept of fleet submarine operations. Battleships, Arizona, Oklahoma, California, and West Virginia lay on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Nevada, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Tennessee were damaged. The climactic surface engagement that American doctrine envisioned would never occur. Admiral Thomas Hart, commanding the Asiatic Fleet, received authorization within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack to execute unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan. No warnings would be given. Every Japanese merchant ship was now a legitimate target. The problem was that American submarines were not ready for this mission. The primary weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo, was fundamentally defective. Its magnetic influence exploder was supposed to detonate beneath a ship's keel, breaking the vessel's back. Instead, the exploder fired prematurely due to variations in Earth's magnetic field, or failed to fire at all. The depth control mechanism was miscalibrated, causing torpedoes to run 11 feet deeper than set. Submarines aimed at a ship's waterline only to watch torpedoes pass harmlessly beneath the keel. The contact exploder often crumpled on impact instead of detonating, allowing torpedoes to bounce off target hulls without exploding. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Ramage of USS Trout recorded the frustration every submarine commander felt in December 1941. He fired 4 torpedoes at a stationary Japanese transport from 1,500 yards range. All 4 struck with metallic clangs that echoed through the submarine's hull. None exploded. The transport sailed away undamaged while Trout dove to avoid counterattacks. These torpedo failures plagued American submarines. Throughout 1942 and into 1943, submarine commanders fired perfect spreads at ideal angles, watched torpedoes strike targets, and saw nothing happen. Ships steamed away unharmed. Patrol reports filled with accounts of non-exploding torpedoes accumulated at Pacific Fleet headquarters. The Bureau of Ordnance, responsible for torpedo development, insisted the weapons were perfect and blamed submarine crews for poor marksmanship. Admiral Charles Lockwood, Commander Submarines Pacific, finally forced the issue through systematic testing. Submarines fired torpedoes at nets suspended at measured depths, proving the depth control ran deep. They fired at Hawaiian cliffs to test contact exploders, demonstrating failure rates exceeding 70%. These tests, conducted in mid-1943, forced the Bureau of Ordnance to acknowledge defects and implement corrections. By late 1943, the depth control was recalibrated. Contact exploders were redesigned with more sensitive firing mechanisms. Magnetic exploders were deactivated after proving too unreliable for combat use. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American submarines possessed weapons that actually worked. The Gato-class submarines entered service at exactly the right moment. 77 boats were commissioned between November 1941 and April 1944. Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, built 41 boats. Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California built 17. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire built 12. Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin, located on a narrow river just off Lake Michigan, built 7. The Manitowoc operation represented American ingenuity at its finest. The shipyard was hundreds of miles from the ocean, connected to the sea only through the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and eventually the Mississippi River. Manitowoc engineers developed a system using floating dry docks to transport completed submarines through locks and canals to the Mississippi, then downstream to New Orleans, where the boats were commissioned and sent to the Pacific. The submarines that emerged from these yards between 1941 and 1944 were impressive machines. Each Gato-class boat measured 311 feet 10 inches in length, with a beam of 27 feet 3 inches. Surface displacement was 1,526 tons, increasing to 2,424 tons submerged as ballast tanks flooded. 4 Fairbanks Morse or General Motors diesel engines generated 5,400 horsepower on the surface. These engines drove electrical generators that either powered the submarine directly or charged massive battery banks. Submerged, electric motors drew power from the batteries, providing 2,600 horsepower for silent running. This diesel-electric system gave Gatos tactical flexibility that diesel-only submarines lacked. On the surface, the boats could sprint at 20.25 knots, fast enough to overhaul most merchant convoys. Submerged, they could cruise at 8.75 knots for short periods or maintain 2 knots for up to 48 hours on batteries. The ability to alternate between high-speed surface running and silent submerged stalking made Gatos perfect ambush predators. Range was equally impressive. A Gato could cruise 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots without refueling, giving them the endurance to patrol from Pearl Harbor to Japanese home waters, operate for weeks, and return safely. Fuel bunkers held 94,000 gallons of diesel. Provisions lasted 90 days, enough food and supplies to sustain 80 officers and men through extended patrols in hostile waters. The armament centered on 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. 6 tubes in the forward torpedo room were arranged in 2 tiers, allowing rapid salvo firing. 4 tubes in the after torpedo room could engage targets during retreat, turning escape into counterattack. Each submarine carried 24 torpedoes total, a mix of Mark 14 steam torpedoes and later the Mark 18 electric torpedoes. Deck armament varied throughout the war, as lessons from combat drove modifications. Early Gatos carried a single 3-inch 50-caliber deck gun mounted on the main deck aft of the conning tower. Combat experience proved this weapon inadequate. Many targets in the Pacific were sampans, fishing boats, or small coastal craft, not worth expensive torpedoes. The deck gun became crucial for engaging these vessels and for finishing off damaged ships. By mid-1943, most Gatos received 4-inch 50-caliber guns salvaged from old S-class submarines. By late 1943, almost all boats were retrofitted with 5-inch 25-caliber guns, some receiving 2 of these weapons. Additional anti-aircraft armament included 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikon cannon to defend against Japanese aircraft. The conning tower underwent continuous modification as combat experience accumulated. Original designs featured tall fairwaters that provided good visibility but created large radar signatures. After war began, these fairwaters were progressively cut down to reduce the boat's silhouette. By 1944, most Gatos sported low-profile conning towers that made them nearly invisible on dark nights. Radar technology transformed submarine operations. Early Gatos received SD air search radar that could detect aircraft at ranges exceeding 20 miles, providing crucial warning time to dive before Japanese patrol planes arrived. In 1943, SJ surface search radar was installed, allowing submarines to detect ships at 15 miles in total darkness. This radar gave American submarines eyes that Japanese escorts lacked, enabling night surface attacks that devastated convoys. The crew complement of 80 men lived in conditions that were cramped but tolerable compared to German U-boats. Officers bunked in tiny staterooms. Enlisted men hot-racked in the torpedo rooms, sleeping in shifts between racks of weapons. The boats featured air conditioning, crucial for operating in tropical waters, refrigeration for fresh food, and even an ice cream maker that became legendary among submariners. These amenities gave American submarines an advantage in crew morale and effectiveness that cannot be understated. German U-boat crews endured appalling conditions, sleeping on bunks that reeked of diesel fumes and condensation. Japanese submarine crews faced similar hardships. American submariners, by contrast, operated in relative comfort, maintaining high morale and effectiveness through patrols lasting 2 months. The first Gato-Class boats entered combat in early 1942, operating from bases in Australia and Pearl Harbor. Their initial operations were hampered by defective torpedoes and cautious tactics inherited from peacetime training. Many early commanders, trained in the 1920s and 30s, approached combat with excessive caution. They made single attacks from long range, fired 1 or 2 torpedoes instead of full spreads, and withdrew at the first sign of opposition. Admiral Lockwood and his staff quickly identified this problem and began relieving overly cautious commanders. In their place, aggressive younger officers like Dudley Morton, Richard O'Kane, Eugene Fluckey, and Samuel Dealey took command. These men pioneered tactics that would become standard doctrine. They made multiple attacks on single convoys, penetrated escort screens to strike from close range, and used night surface attacks to maximum advantage. USS Wahoo, under Morton's command, demonstrated what aggressive tactics could achieve. In January 1943, Wahoo penetrated a Japanese convoy in the Palau Islands and sank 4 ships in a single attack. Morton's tactics were revolutionary. Instead of making a single attack and withdrawing, he tracked the convoy for hours, attacking repeatedly from different angles until his torpedoes were exhausted or the convoy scattered. By mid-1943, working torpedoes and aggressive commanders combined to make Gato-Class submarines lethal commerce raiders. USS Gato herself completed 9 war patrols, sinking 13 confirmed ships. USS Silversides completed 14 patrols and was officially credited with sinking 23 ships, the third highest total by number of vessels for any American submarine. But the true measure of submarine effectiveness was tonnage destroyed, not number of ships. 3 Gato-class submarines achieved records that remain unmatched. USS Flasher, commissioned in September 1943, completed 6 war patrols and sank 21 ships totaling 100,231 tons, the highest tonnage total by any American submarine during the war. USS Rasher, built at Manitowoc and commissioned in June 1943, completed 8 patrols and sank 18 ships totaling 99,901 tons. Post-war analysis later credited Rasher with the second highest tonnage, as some ships originally credited to other submarines were found to have been sunk by Rasher. USS Barb, commissioned in July 1942, completed 12 patrols under Commander Eugene Fluckey and sank 17 ships. Barb's tactics were particularly innovative. When targets became scarce in late 1944, Fluckey began attacking Japanese coastal installations with his deck gun and even conducted a commando raid on mainland Japan, the only ground combat operation by American submarine crew during the war. The collective impact of the Gato-class submarines on Japanese merchant shipping exceeded anything naval planners had projected before the war. By 1944, these 77 submarines, combined with their successor Balao and Tench classes, had created a maritime stranglehold around Japan that proved more devastating than strategic bombing or surface naval battles. The mathematics of destruction were brutal and undeniable. Japan began the war with 6.4 million tons of merchant shipping. To sustain the empire's war economy and supply military operations across the Pacific, Japanese planners calculated they needed a minimum of 5.9 million tons in constant operation. Every month, American submarines were sinking more tonnage than Japanese shipyards could replace. In 1942, despite defective torpedoes and cautious tactics, American submarines sank approximately 180 ships, totaling 725,000 tons. In 1943, with partially corrected torpedoes and more aggressive commanders, submarines sank approximately 335 ships, totaling 1.5 million tons. But 1944, with fully functional weapons and perfected tactics, became the year of slaughter. From January through December 1944, American submarines sank over 600 ships, totaling nearly 2.7 million tons. The Gato-class boats, now veterans of multiple patrols with experienced crews and reliable weapons, accounted for a significant portion of these losses. Japanese merchant marine casualties climbed past 90,000 killed. Troop transports carrying reinforcements to embattled garrisons went to the bottom with thousands of soldiers trapped in holds. Tankers bringing desperately needed oil from the Dutch East Indies exploded in massive fireballs that lit the night sky for miles. For Japanese merchant mariners, The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. Captain Tamichi Hara, a destroyer commander assigned to convoy escort duty, wrote in his diary in April 1944 that American submarines had created a terror that naval combat could not match. Unlike surface battles where men could see their enemy and fight back, submarine warfare was a war against ghosts. Submarines appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating effect, and vanished before escorts could respond. Japanese sailors described the sound that haunted their nightmares, the churning wake of incoming torpedoes, audible for perhaps 20 seconds before impact. In those 20 seconds, men had to decide whether to jump overboard or run for lifeboats. Usually there was no time for either. The torpedo struck, the ship shuddered, and water rushed in. If you were below decks, you drowned. If you were on deck, you might survive, but only if the ship sank slowly enough for lifeboats to launch. Most ships went down in minutes. The August 18, 1944 attack on convoy HI-71 by USS Rasher exemplified the devastation Gato-Class submarines could inflict. Commander Willard Lafon had been tracking the convoy since afternoon, using Rasher's SJ surface search radar to maintain contact while remaining invisible beyond visual range. As darkness fell, he maneuvered into attack position. The convoy consisted of 13 ships, including the escort carrier Taiyo, 6 large transports, and numerous escorts. At 22:10 hours, Lafon fired 2 stern torpedoes at tanker Teiyo Maru. Both struck. The tanker, loaded with aviation gasoline, exploded in a column of flame 300 meters high. Pieces of the ship blew 150 meters from the burning hulk. The escorts fired wildly, dropping depth charges far behind Rasher's position. At 23:10 hours, Lafon fired 6 bow torpedoes at the largest ship in the convoy. 3 torpedoes struck transport Teiyo Maru, the 17,537-ton former French liner carrying 4,795 Japanese soldiers and 427 civilians. The ship began sinking immediately. Panic swept through darkened holds as water rushed in. Men clawed at ladders, fighting to reach the deck. Most never made it. Teiyo Maru sank in approximately 4 minutes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When survivors were counted days later, 2,665 people had died. Only about 2,100 survived the initial sinking to float in storm-tossed water. Before rescue vessels could recover them, heavy seas from an approaching typhoon drowned hundreds more. Aboard escort carrier Taiyo, Captain Kimura ordered aircraft to search for the attacking submarine. Before planes could launch, USS Redfish fired 4 torpedoes at Taiyo. 2 struck home. The carrier's aviation fuel ignited. Fire spread through the hangar deck. Taiyo sank at approximately 22:30 hours with 850 crew members. Shortly after midnight, Rasher fired 4 more torpedoes at cargo transport Ayan Maru. 3 hit. The ship was carrying ammunition. The resulting detonations swept a pressure wave over Rasher's bridge 2,000 meters away, stunning the crew. Commander Lafon swung Rasher hard right and fired 2 stern torpedoes at armed merchant cruiser Noshiro Maru. Both torpedoes hit. The ship slowed to 5 knots, then began sinking. At 03:33 hours, USS Spadefish, under Lieutenant Commander Gordon Underwood, joined the attack, firing 6 torpedoes at landing craft depot ship Tamatsu Maru. 2 torpedoes struck. The massive 460-foot vessel rolled over and sank within minutes. 4,755 troops and 135 merchant seamen went down with the ship. That afternoon, rescue vessels found Tamatsu Maru's debris field. Approximately 2,000 bodies floated in the water. Heavy seas prevented effective rescue operations. Most survivors in the water drowned over the following hours, as storms made recovery impossible. In less than 5 hours, convoy HI-71 had been destroyed. 7 ships sunk or crippled. Over 8,500 Japanese personnel killed. not a single American casualty. The submarines withdrew without damage. The psychological impact of convoy HI-71's destruction rippled through the entire Japanese merchant marine and naval command. Rear Admiral Suto Musato, who would later command convoy HI-81, wrote in a confidential report to the Grand Escort Force that American submarines had perfected submarine warfare to a degree Japan could not match. They attacked in coordinated groups using radar to track convoys while remaining invisible. They fired accurate torpedoes from positions Japanese escorts could not detect. Japanese escorts were helpless, dropping depth charges randomly, hoping for lucky hits while thousands of soldiers drowned. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fundamental problem was that Japan had never prepared for a war against submarines. The Imperial Japanese Navy, obsessed with offensive operations and battleship combat, viewed convoy protection as defensive, unglamorous work, unworthy of top officers and modern equipment. This cultural bias, combined with fixation on decisive surface battles, left merchant shipping catastrophically vulnerable. The Grand Escort Command, Japan's belated attempt to organize convoy protection, was not established until November 1943, nearly 2 years into the war. Even then, it received mostly obsolete destroyers, poorly trained crews, and minimal resources. Japanese planners requested 360 anti-submarine frigates. They received 40. These vessels lacked modern sonar, possessed only primitive depth charges, and operated without air support or coordinated tactics. American submarines equipped with SJ radar could detect Japanese escorts equipped with outdated listening devices could detect submarines only at ranges under 2,000 yards, usually too late to prevent attacks. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine emphasized aggressive counterattacks rather than convoy protection. Escorts would chase submarines after attacks instead of remaining with merchant ships. This left convoys vulnerable to follow-up attacks by other submarines in the area. American submarine commanders learned to exploit this weakness. One submarine would attack, drawing away escorts, while others moved in to finish the convoy. Even operating independently, commanders like Lafon assumed Japanese escorts would chase after attacks, leaving damaged vessels exposed for additional strikes. Japanese merchant ship construction could not replace losses. American submarines in 1944 sank ships faster than Japanese shipyards could build them. Japan's annual shipbuilding capacity was approximately 1 million tons. American submarines were sinking over 2 million tons annually. The mathematics were brutal. Every month, Japan's merchant fleet shrank. By mid-1944, critical raw materials, oil, and food could not reach Japanese factories and cities in sufficient quantities. The submarine blockade was strangling Japan more effectively than any surface campaign could achieve. Strategic resources accumulated in Southeast Asian ports because there were no ships to transport them safely. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, all remained where produced because merchant captains refused to sail, and ships no longer existed to carry cargo. The human cost exceeded anything measured in tonnage statistics. Japanese soldiers boarding transports knew they faced a high probability of dying at sea. Trapped in flooded compartments as submarines, they never saw sent torpedoes crashing through steel hulls. Ensign Haruki Itito, who survived the sinking of Mayasan Maru by USS Pikuda in November 1944, described the experience in a 1978 interview that captured the terror every Japanese sailor felt. The torpedo hit sounded like a massive hammer striking an iron plate. The ship lurched violently. Men fell down ladders, crushing those below. Water rushed into the hold. Emergency lighting failed immediately. In complete darkness, Thousands of men tried to reach the deck. Most could not find the ladders. Those who did found them clogged with panicking soldiers. The ship rolled and began sinking. Itito was on deck when the torpedo struck, which saved his life. He jumped into the water and swam away from the ship. She sank in approximately 2 minutes. The suction pulled men underwater. He heard them screaming, then silence. Itito floated in the water for 18 hours before a patrol boat found him. Of the 4,500 men aboard, fewer than 700 survived. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ship sinking and heard the screaming. It never stopped. For the crews of Gato-Class submarines, combat was a strange mixture of boredom, tension, and sudden violence. Patrols lasted 60 to 75 days. Submarines spent weeks traveling to patrol areas, days or weeks searching for targets, then minutes or hours in actual combat before withdrawing to avoid counterattacks. Life aboard a Gato during patrol followed rigid routines designed to maintain crew efficiency and morale. Days were divided into 6-hour watches. Men rotated through stations, standing watch, sleeping, eating, and maintaining equipment in constant cycles. The boats ran submerged during daylight hours to avoid Japanese aircraft, surfacing at night to recharge batteries and search for targets using radar. When radar detected a convoy, the submarine went to battle stations. The approach could take hours as the commander maneuvered into attack position, balancing the need to get close against the risk of detection. The tension during approach was palpable. Every man knew that if escorts detected them before firing, depth charges would follow, and depth charging was the experience every submariner feared most. Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb described depth charging as controlled terror. The submarine went deep, rigged for silent running, all unnecessary equipment shut down to minimize noise. The crew waited in darkness broken only by red battle lights, listening to destroyer propellers overhead. Then the depth charges began exploding. Each detonation was a hammer blow that rang through the hull, knocked men off their feet, shattered light bulbs, and sprung leaks. Close explosions could crack hull plates, rupture tanks, or disable machinery. The psychological strain was immense. Men could do nothing but wait, hoping the boat was deep enough, hoping the hull would hold, hoping the next pattern would not land directly overhead. Depth charge attacks could last hours. The record was endured by USS Harder, which survived over 300 depth charges during a single attack in June 1944. But when attacks succeeded, when torpedoes struck targets and ships began sinking, the crew's tension transformed into exhilaration. Commander Lafon described the feeling aboard Rasher after sinking Maru. The explosion was visible through the periscope, a massive fireball erupting where 17,000 tons of ship had been moments before. The crew cheered, breaking the silent tension that had gripped them during the approach. They had struck a devastating blow against an enemy that had killed American sailors at Pearl Harbor and tortured prisoners across the Pacific. The moral complexity of submarine warfare rarely troubled American crews during combat. They were killing enemy sailors and soldiers, legitimate targets under the rules of war. But some sinkings carried additional weight. Submarine commanders had no way to know if transports carried prisoners of war. Japanese vessels were not marked according to Geneva Convention protocols. When submarines torpedoed unmarked transports, sometimes Allied prisoners died alongside Japanese troops. The sinking of hell ships, as survivors called them, killed an estimated 10,800 Allied prisoners of war during the Pacific conflict. USS Rasher sank Maru in August 1944, killing 2,665 people. Unknown to Commander Lafon, approximately 300 Allied prisoners were aboard, forced laborers being transported to Japan. They died with the Japanese soldiers and crew. American submarine commanders learned of these deaths only after the war ended. The knowledge haunted some for the rest of their lives, but during combat, they could not afford to hesitate. Every Japanese ship was a potential target carrying troops, supplies, or materials that sustained enemy war efforts. The unrestricted submarine warfare, authorized by Admiral Nimitz, meant that every vessel in Japanese service was legitimate prey. By late 1944, the cumulative effect of Gato-Class and other American submarine operations had achieved what strategic planners called economic strangulation. Japan's imports of strategic materials plunged from 16.4 million tons in 1943 to 10 million tons in 1944. Oil imports fell from approximately 49 million barrels in 1942 to less than 10 million barrels in 1944. Without oil, the combined fleet could not operate. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers sat in port as floating batteries because fuel could not be spared for operations. Aircraft remained grounded because aviation gasoline could not reach air bases. Pilot training was curtailed because fuel for training flights did not exist. The mighty military machine that had conquered Southeast Asia and threatened Australia was being paralyzed not by defeat in battle, but by starvation of its logistics. The impact extended beyond military operations. Japanese factories required raw materials that no longer arrived. Steel mills lacked iron ore. Munitions plants lacked copper and aluminum. Food imports from Korea and Manchuria, desperately needed to feed Japanese civilians, could not be transported safely. By early 1945, rationing in Japan had reduced the average civilian to near starvation levels. The submarine campaign achieved these results with a force that never exceeded 288 actively commissioned boats and 36,000 personnel. The submarine service represented less than 2% of the United States Navy's total strength, but inflicted more than half of all Japanese maritime losses. This made submarine warfare the most cost-effective naval strategy in history. The price paid by American submariners was proportionally high. 52 submarines were lost during the war, 20 of them Gato-class boats. USS Corvina was sunk by Japanese submarine Ione 76 in November 1943, the only American submarine sunk by an enemy submarine during the entire war. USS Wahoo was sunk exiting the Sea of Japan through La Perouse Strait in October 1943 with all hands lost, including Commander Dudley Morton. USS Tang was lost to her own malfunctioning torpedo in October 1944 after sinking 13 ships on her fifth patrol, the most successful single patrol by any American submarine. USS Grenadier was scuttled after being damaged by Japanese aircraft in May 1943, with crew taken prisoner and subjected to brutal treatment. USS Sculpin was sunk by Japanese destroyers in November 1943, with survivors captured and transported on the carrier Chuyo, which was subsequently torpedoed by USS Sailfish, killing the Sculpin prisoners in a tragic irony. 3,506 American submariners died during the war, representing a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any American service branch. Every man who volunteered for submarine duty knew the risks. Submarines that failed to return from patrol simply disappeared. Families received telegrams stating their loved ones were missing, presumed lost. No bodies were recovered. No graves marked their sacrifice. They remained on eternal patrol, entombed in steel coffins on the ocean floor. But those who survived achieved results that exceeded all expectations. By early 1945, Japanese shipping had been reduced to such catastrophic levels that American submarines struggled to find targets. Commander Eugene Fluckey of USS Barb began attacking trains and factories along the Japanese coast with his deck gun because merchant ships no longer sailed. Some submarines returned from patrols having never fired in their torpedoes. The strategic impact went far beyond simple tonnage figures. Operation Show, Japan's plan to defend the Philippines, required massive reinforcement of garrison forces. American submarines prevented these reinforcements from arriving. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was fought with Japanese forces in the Philippines significantly weaker than planned because submarines had sunk the transport convoys carrying reinforcements. Japanese defensive positions throughout the Pacific Islands suffered from inadequate supplies and undermanned garrisons because submarines interdicted supply lines. General Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping strategy succeeded partly because Japanese garrisons were isolated, undersupplied, and unable to receive reinforcements. American submarines created this isolation. Every bypassed Japanese garrison that withered on its island while MacArthur advanced toward Japan was a garrison that submarines had cut off from support. The strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities succeeded partly because Japanese fighters lacked fuel to intercept American bombers. Submarines had sunk the tankers that would have brought oil from the Dutch East Indies to Japanese refineries. By March 1945, Japan's oil stockpiles were essentially depleted. The combined fleet could not sortie for lack of fuel. Aircraft sat grounded. Training flights were cancelled. The once mighty Imperial Japanese Navy, reduced to a handful of operational warships, remained in port as floating batteries. In April 1945, the super battleship Yamato sortied on a suicide mission toward Okinawa, with only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The fuel shortage was so severe that tankers siphoned oil from decommissioned ships to provide Yamato's fuel. American carrier aircraft sank Yamato on April 7, 1945, but the sortie itself demonstrated how completely submarines had strangled Japan's fuel supply. By summer 1945, maritime traffic in Japanese home waters had nearly ceased. The aerial mining campaign, launched by B-29 bombers from the Marianas, complemented submarine operations, laying thousands of mines in harbours and shipping channels. These mines sank or damaged hundreds of ships and blocked access to repair yards. The combination of submarine warfare and aerial mining completely paralysed Japanese maritime transportation. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the merchant marine that remained consisted of 1.5 million tons of mostly damaged or barely operational vessels. Of the original 6.4 million tons that existed in December 1941, plus 3.9 million tons built during the war, 8.8 million tons had been sunk or destroyed. The Japanese merchant fleet had been annihilated more thoroughly than any merchant fleet in history. American submarines accounted for 56% of these losses. The remaining 44% came from aircraft, mines, and surface actions. The 1,314 ships sunk by submarines included not just merchant vessels, but also one battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and over 200 smaller warships. No single weapons system in World War II achieved comparable strategic impact with such a small force. The Gato-Class submarines formed the backbone of this achievement. Of the 77 boats commissioned, 57 survived the war. 20 were lost in combat or accidents, a 26% loss rate that reflected the dangerous nature of submarine operations. But the surviving boats and their crews had fundamentally changed naval warfare and submarine doctrine worldwide. USS Flasher's record of 100,231 tons sunk stood as the highest tonnage destroyed by any American submarine. USS Rasher's 99,901 tons placed her second. USS Barb's 17 confirmed ships and innovative tactics made Commander Flockey a legend. These achievements were multiplied across the entire class, creating a campaign of destruction that strangled an empire. For Japanese merchant mariners who survived the war, the memories never faded. In a 1987 reunion in Tokyo, 82-year-old former Captain Teiji Yamada described nightmares that persisted 4 decades after the war. Every night he dreamed of submarines. He saw periscopes breaking the surface, heard torpedoes launching, watched ships sink while men screamed. For 42 years, the same dream. The Americans were ghosts, he said. We never saw them, but they were everywhere. 6 Gato-Class submarines were preserved as museums: USS Cod in Cleveland, USS Drum in Mobile, USS Silversides in Muskegon. These steel monuments allow modern visitors to walk through cramped corridors and understand what submarine crews endured. The legacy extends beyond museums. The tactics developed by Gato commanders became doctrine taught worldwide. The strategic lesson remained clear. Small forces using advanced technology could achieve effects far beyond their numbers. The final accounting reveals the magnitude of what 77 submarines accomplished. Over 5 million tons of Japanese shipping destroyed. More than 1,300 vessels sunk, an empire strangled into submission. The Gato-Class submarines proved that naval warfare had fundamentally changed, that submarines would dominate future conflicts, and that courage, skill, and determination could overcome any enemy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Japanese feared American submarines more than anything else because they represented a threat that could not be countered, could not be seen, could not be escaped. The Gato-class boats were the instruments of this terror, the steel sharks that hunted in the depths and emerged victorious from the greatest submarine campaign in history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.